In this video, we'll learn everything you need to know to start using Tailwind in your projects. We'll create a simple hamburger menu and go over the basic properties, how to add transitions, make your CSS responsive, and even add a dark mode. But first, what is Tailwind? Well, unlike component libraries like Material UI and Semantic UI, Tailwind does not give you pre-built components. Instead, it provides you with utility classes for most CSS properties like background colors, font sizes, padding, and much more. And since values like colors and sizes are standardized by Tailwind for you, it's a lot easier to style your website. With that being said, let's check out how to use it. So we're going to start off with a basic React project setup on our left-hand side using Vite. However, Tailwind can be used with anything from pure HTML to Angular, whatever you want, but for our project, we'll be using React with Vite. And the documentation makes it very easy to set up your Tailwind project. So we've already done the first step where we set up our React project. In the second step, we'll firstly install all of the packages required. So we'll install Tailwind CSS, Post CSS, and Auto Prefixer. And then we'll run this command to initialize everything related to Tailwind in our project. After that, you'll see some files have been created on the left-hand side. The main one we want is tailwind.config.js for now. And what we'll do is we'll take these two values and we'll paste it inside our content array over here. And the next thing we'll do is we'll go into our index.css. And right now it's empty, but we want to add these directives to our index.css. And this basically imports a bunch of classes and styles from Tailwind so that we can use it inside our application. And then lastly, we'll just run npm run dev and start our app. And if we refresh, we see that we have an app with some nice styling applied, some sans serif. Now everything is set up. The last thing we need to do is install our icon library, which isn't required for Tailwind. It's just for this project. So npm install lucid-react. And while that's installing, I'd like to just point your attention to an extension which is really useful if you're using VS Code and you're working on Tailwind. And that extension is called Tailwind CSS IntelliSense. And it basically suggests classes for you to use while you're typing them out. Now, the first thing we need to do is define a height and width for our app component. And it should be equal to 100% of the viewport width and 100% of the viewport height. And instead for the class names, what you should usually do is go into the documentation. And if we search for the width properties given to us by Tailwind, we have a bunch of predefined properties. So w-1 is equal to 0.25 rem, similarly for w-10. And we see we have a bunch of properties. We also have percentages given to us as fractions. But at the bottom, we have something called w-screen, which is what we're looking for, which is 100 VW. So all we do is over here, we go w-screen. And you can see that VS Code is automatically recommending classes for us based on the IntelliSense that we added. So we'll choose w-screen. And then if we save and do npm run dev, we won't see anything for now, but we'll add the other classes. So firstly, we'll do h-screen as well so that it's the full height. Next, we want to add a background color for our app. And again, we'll go into the documentation and you can see we have a bunch of values. And each color ranges from 50 to 950, and as the number increases, it gets darker. You don't need to remember it all, just come to the documentation, and whenever you like a color, just get the value. In our case, we'll do bg-slate-50. And if we save, we see that the color changes and it's equal to the entire viewport height and width. The next thing we want to do is bring our app to the center of the page. And usually you would make it a flex box. So all we'd have to do is write down flex. And you can see it's equal to display flex on the right hand side. We want to justify the content to center. So we'll say justify, and you see a bunch of values are recommended, and justify center suits our need. And then next we want to do align item center. And in this case, it's items-center. So if we save that, we have our app in the middle of the page now. Now we want to make a menu. So in our src folder, we'll make a new folder called components. And then let's create a menu.jsx. Let's do rafce to create our component. And again, that's a VS Code extension that I have. It's this one, the ES7 snippets. So we'll save that and then go back into app.jsx. And instead of the app over here, we'll render out the menu component that we have. Now let's just go over some basic properties. So outside, we'll create a container. We'll give it a class name. And we'll make it flex. We want to give it a flex direction of column. And for that, we can do flex-call. We want to align the items to the start. So we can say items-start. For each item, we want to have it have a gap of 4. So we can just say gap-4. And you can see that basically means 1 rem of gap between each item. And then we want it to be relatively positioned because the dropdown will be absolutely positioned inside it. So we'll just give it a value of relative, which is equal to position relative. And again, you might not remember these from the get-go, but if you work on a few projects, you'll know it like the back of your hand. Now, the first child inside this will be a container for our icon. So we'll give a div over here. We'll give it a class name. Firstly, inside, let's render the menu icon. So we'll say menu icon and import that from Lucid. And we see that being rendered out now. Now let's add some class names. So firstly, we'll add a background as well. So bg-slate-50. We wanted to have a rounded border, and Tailwind gives us an easy way to do that. We can just say rounded. We have a few varieties, XL, LG, MD, but we'll just do basic rounded for now. We'll give it some padding, and padding is denoted by P dash, and we'll give it a value of 2. Now we also want to give it a shadow, and that's extremely complex using CSS. You'd have to work with colors and gradients. In Tailwind, all you need to do is do shadow-MD, and you automatically have a shadow over here. So that's it for the button. Below that, let's add the drop down. So we'll create another div. Let's just add some text inside for now. So we'll say drop down, and let's start giving it the class name. So firstly, we want it to be positioned absolutely. So absolute is the first class name. From the top, we want it to be 14. And from the left, we want it to be 0. So we see that the drop down is being rendered over there. We'll give it a BG slate of 50. We'll make it rounded again, P-2, shadow-LG this time. So we see that the shadow is slightly different. And now let's give it a minimum width. So we do min-W. And we have a bunch of values defined for us, but there might be cases where you want to use custom weird values which don't fit with what Tailwind gives you. In cases like this, you can do dash, and then inside square brackets, you can define any value you want. So you can say something like 200 pixels. And you see that that's already applied for you. And you can do this with many other properties as well. So if you ever see a value which you don't like, you can use a custom value inside square brackets. Lastly, we'll make it flex-call, and give it a gap of 1 and save it. Now we don't want just text inside here, so we'll create another component and call it menu item.jsx array-fce. And for the props, we'll take in two things, children and icon. Inside the outside div, we'll have another div. Over here, we'll render out the icon. And then below that, we'll just render out whichever children are given to us. Let's add that over here. So we'll say menu item. The first one will have an icon of user, which we get from Lucid. And the text inside it will be user details. And we'll copy paste that a few times. For this one, we'll have an icon of line chart, and we'll call that analytics. And lastly, we'll have an icon of settings, and we'll just call that settings. And one thing, we should call this children, and we see that it's being rendered out now. Now let's add styling to our menu item. So for the outside div, we'll give it a class name. We'll make it flex, gap of 2, items center. We want to change the font size, and for that, we can use text-XL. You can see we can make it very big, like 7XL as well, but we'll do XL in our case. We want to make our drop-down items rounded. We want it to take up the full width of the drop-down. We want to have it a X padding of 2, which is equal to 0.5 rem, and a Y padding of 2 as well. And of course, if you just wanted to have it all combined, you can just give it a value of P-2 as well and save that. And then lastly, let's add the logic for actually opening and closing the drop-down. So before we do that, we'll install another important and useful library when dealing with class names. You don't need this for Tailwind, but it's pretty useful. It's called class names. So npm install class names. And this library basically helps us dealing with multiple class names for the same component and some times where you use logic in your class name. So we'll go into our menu component, and at the top say const menu open and set menu open equal to use state, and set the initial value to false. Now for the div that contains our icon, we'll just add an on click. We'll set that to a function which calls set menu open. It takes the previous value and sets it equal to not previous. Now, the way we control whether this dropdown appears or not is by changing the class name of this container over here. So the first thing we'll do is we'll wrap it in curly braces because we'll be using some logic over here. So we'll say curly braces. And at the very top, what we want to do is import cn from class names. Let's go back over here and we'll wrap this string with parentheses and call the cn function. Right now, all it's doing is just taking the string and returning back the same string. But what we can do is add a comma and then add another object. And over here, we can define properties that are applied on certain cases. So we'll have the opacity 0 and scale -95 properties, which are applied when not menu open. And the properties opacity -100 and scale -100 applied when menu is open. And save that. And as you can see, we're basically adding some logic to our class names in a very easy to read and simple manner. So now you can see that the dropdown is closed, and if we click on this button, it opens as well and closes as we click on it. So the next thing we'll take a look at is pseudo-selectors. So you know that in normal CSS we have pseudo-selectors like focus and hover, and you can use them in Tailwind as well. So for example, when we hover over this button, we want to see a pointer instead of just a normal cursor. So what we can do is go over here in the class name for our container, and we can actually say on hover colon show us the cursor dash pointer property. So only when you hover over this will the cursor dash pointer property be applied. And similarly, let's say on hover, make the shadow large so we can see it. And now you'll see if you hover over this div, we see a larger shadow and then the cursor is a pointer. Similarly, when we're hovering over the menu items, let's make them blue. So let's go into menu item.jsx and let's say hover bg-blue-100 and save. And as you can see now, when we hover over the items, they're blue. So you can use the hover or focus pseudo selectors or any pseudo selector you can think of, and whichever class you follow up with it will be applied when that property is true. And of course, you can find more pseudo selectors in the Tailwind docs. By the way, if you've learned something new, consider subscribing and join the Discord server linked in the description to connect with developers like yourself and join the community. Now let's take a look at transitions. If you take a look at the button, you'll see that the shadow does change when we hover over it, but it's quite abrupt and jarring. And we can add a bit of easing in of this using transitions. So we'll go into menu.jsx, and to add some transition, what you can do is add the transition-all property. And what this will do is it will detect any changes that are happening to your styling. So for example, when you hover, the cursor dash pointer class name is applied, which is a change in styling. So this will detect all of your changes in the transitions that you have. We'll give it a smoothing of ease in out, and we'll say take a duration of 100 to go from the first property to the next property being applied. So what that means is now if we hover over the button, we see that it slowly graduates from the original shadow to the new shadow. We can take this and add it to the drop-down container as well. And if we paste that, we'll see that the scale and the opacity as it comes in, it's a lot more gradual now instead of abruptly coming into the screen. So the next thing we'll do is we'll make our hamburger menu responsive so that when there's a narrower screen, this icon will not be rendered and only the text will be rendered. And making your website responsive in Tailwind is very easy. If we see the documentation, we see that they already define a bunch of breakpoints for us. And the rule is that by default, you define the styling for the smaller screens. And using the Tailwind media queries, define the styling for any size, including and larger than the query that you're adding. So to see what that means, we'll go into our app back again. And since we want to work on the icons, let's go to the div here and give it a class name. And for smaller screens, we want it to be hidden. So we'll add the hidden property. But if the screen size is SM or bigger, we want it to appear. So we'll say SM of block. So what this basically shows is you define the property shown to the user on narrower devices first, and then using the breakpoints, you define it for wider screens. And now we see that for narrower screens, it's not visible, but if we increase the screen size, we see the icons again. Now, one thing you might want to do is define your own Tailwind class variables that you can use over here. So let's take a look at what that means. Let's add a button below all of these menu items. And we'll add the button. It'll say sign out. And for the class name, we'll give it a text-white, font-bold, rounded, and p-2, and save that. Now it'll be nice to give it a background color of red, so we could do something like bg-red-500. But in case you change your styling later on, you will have this color being used all around your application, while instead you could have something like bg-warning. And if you ever want to change the color for that and apply it to your entire application, you would just need to change the definition of this variable and it would change. And to do that, all we need to do is go into tailwind.config.js. Inside extend, we will add the colors property, and we will define a new property called warning. And we could give it a hex value, or we could just say red, or we could import it, or we could import styles from Tailwind. So we'll say import styles from Tailwind CSS / colors, and we'll say that the warning is equal to styles dot red 500, and save that. And if we open it, we see that the warning variable that we just defined works, because over here we're saying bg-warning. So for the bg value, it's applying the color that's assigned to the warning variable over here. Again, you can do this for anything: padding, background color, text color, anything. And this is just an example. And let's just change the text over here. Now this only works if your class name fits the naming convention of Tailwind, such as bg dash or text dash. If you want a completely new class name, there's a different way to do it. For example, let's go into our menu item, and say we want to apply this entire class to a new class name called menu-item. We'll go into our index.css and use the add layer directive. And in the components layer, we'll add a new class name .menu-item. And we'll use @apply. And we'll paste the properties that we want to apply for this particular class. And now all we need to do is give it a class name of menu-item and save. And if we refresh, we see that it works the same way as it did before, because it's fetching this menu item class from our index.css. Now the last thing we'll do is add a dark mode. So now in app.jsx, we'll just go above our menu over here and add a button with a few class names, which will function as the button which toggles the dark mode. And let's just add flex-call and gap-2 over here. Now there's two ways of doing dark mode in Tailwind. We'll go into tailwind.config.js, and there's a property called dark mode, and it can take in a few values. The main one we'll take a look at is media and class. So what media basically means, it gets the default value in your computer's configuration, and based on that, it makes it either dark or light mode. So it's based on whatever the user has selected for their machine. So you can set that, or if you want to have a toggle button, you can set class. And if you have dark mode configured to class, you need to add some code on your own. Firstly, what we'll do is in app.jsx, the outermost div will need to have a class name of dark if you want dark mode on. And then inside our components, and then inside our various elements, we'll use the dark pseudo-selector to define which properties get added when any parent has the class name of dark. So in our case, for the outermost div, let's just give it a dark of bg-black. And then we already have a dark for this button. So if we save that, we see that dark is applied. And if we remove this class name, we see that it gets removed. So let's quickly make it toggleable by this button over here. So we'll just say const is dark, set is dark, is equal to use state and false. And over here, then easy way to make to add functionality over here is import cn from class names. We say cn, and then basically apply the dark property only when is dark is equal to true. And then for this button, we'll just add the on-click property. And now we see that we can actually toggle the dark mode on and off. So let's quickly add some dark properties for our entire hamburger menu over here. For the container of our icon, we want dark bg slate 800 and dark text-white. And similarly for our drop-down container over here. And we see that that works properly now. And then for our menu item over here, let's just say that on dark and on hover, so we can combine pseudo-selectors, we want bg-blue-900. and then that works as well. So that's everything you need to know to use Tailwind CSS in your app. If you don't remember all the class names, don't worry. Just refer to the documentation, and as you work on apps, you'll start remembering them more and more. And if you like the video, leave a like and comment down below what topic you'd like me to cover next. Until next time, thanks for watching.